There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their true weight concealed until much later, when you look back and see them for the tectonic plates they were, shifting the entire landscape of your world. And then there are moments that announce themselves with the force of a tidal wave, moments so immense you feel the air pressure change, the ground tremble beneath your feet. You know, even as you are living it, that this is a before and after. This is the hinge upon which your life will swing. For me, that moment was not a quiet revelation in the dark, nor a whispered confession over coffee. It was a public spectacle, bathed in the soft, unforgiving light of a June afternoon, set to the gentle strains of a string quartet. It was the moment I stood as best man at the wedding of the only person I had ever truly loved, and watched him prepare to promise his forever to someone else. The air in the old church was thick with the scent of lilies and beeswax, a cloying sweetness that coated the back of my throat. It was a beautiful day, the kind of day photographers like me dream of, with sunlight slanting through the stained glass windows and kaleidoscopic pillars, painting the stone floor in hues of sapphire and ruby. Every detail was perfect, curated with the meticulous care of his fiancée, Amelia. The ivory ribbons on the pews, the tasteful arrangements of white roses and eucalyptus, the hushed, expectant rustle of the guests. It was a perfect picture, a perfect lie. From my place beside the altar, I had a flawless vantage point. I could see the nervous tremor in Leo's hand as he adjusted his tie for the 10th time. I could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow that no one else would notice. I saw him glance at the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave, waiting for his bride, but his eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a different kind of waiting, a different kind of panic. They held the weight of the last 3 months, the weight of a secret that had grown between us like a living thing, silent and suffocating. I was supposed to be the stoic pillar, the best friend, the keeper of the rings, and the deliverer of a witty, charming speech. My role was clearly defined, a character in a play I had helped write. But inside the carefully constructed facade of my tuxedo, my heart was a frantic, trapped bird, beating its wings against the cage of my ribs. Every breath was a conscious effort, a fight against the urge to either bolt from the church or shout the truth into the sacred silence. The truth was a complex, tangled thing, a tapestry woven from years of unspoken feelings, of late-night conversations that skirted the edge of confession, of a physical intimacy that had no name and 1,000 plausible deniability clauses. The truth was that the man waiting at the altar, the handsome, charming, brilliant man who was the center of this whole universe, had been sleeping in my bed for the better part of a year, his body curled against mine in the dark, seeking a solace he couldn't find anywhere else. The truth was, he had kissed me, once, with a desperation that had shattered me. And the truth was, in the weeks that followed, he had pretended it never happened, retreating behind a wall of cheerful denial as he marched relentlessly toward this very altar, this very moment. The organ swelled, a triumphant, gut-wrenching sound that signaled the beginning of the procession. The heavy doors swung open, and there she was. Amelia, a vision in white, her face obscured by a delicate veil, backlit by the afternoon sun like an angel in a Renaissance painting. A collective sigh of admiration rippled through the guests. Leo's breath hitched beside me. He straightened his shoulders, composing his face into a mask of pure adoration. It was a masterful performance. I had to give him that. He was a brilliant software engineer, a man who built logical, elegant systems out of chaos. He was applying that same skill to his own life now, forcing the chaotic, messy data of his heart into a clean, acceptable output. He turned his head slightly, and his gaze found mine one last time. It was a fleeting connection, a microsecond in the grand sweep of the ceremony, but in that fraction of a second, I saw it all. The terror, the regret, the silent, desperate plea. And in that moment, I knew. This perfect day was not an ending. It was a detonation. And we were all standing at ground zero. Our story didn't begin with a crisis. It began, as most important things do, with the mundane. We met in a chlorine-scented haze during our freshman year of college. We were both on the swim team, two bodies among many, cutting through the cold, blue water of the university pool before the sun was even up. Leo was impossible to miss. He had a laugh that could fill the cavernous natatorium, a shock of dark hair that was always falling into his eyes, and a powerful, graceful freestyle stroke that left everyone else churning in his wake. He was magnetic, drawing people into his orbit with an effortless charm. He was the sun, and the rest of us were just planets, content to circle him. I was, by nature, a quieter celestial body. I preferred the periphery, the silent observation deck. My world was framed through the lens of a camera, my thoughts composed in light and shadow. I found my rhythm in the solitary burn of a long-distance set, the methodical repetition of laps, the quiet focus of my own breathing. I'm not sure he even knew my name for the first 2 months. To him, I was just Lane 4, the lanky guy with the waterproof camera who was always taking pictures of the way the light refracted through the water. But then came the mid-season training trip to Florida, a grueling week of two-a-day practices under a relentless sun. One evening, after a particularly brutal afternoon session, I was sitting alone on the beach, trying to capture the bruised purples and fiery oranges of the sunset, when he collapsed onto the sand next to me. He didn't say anything for a long time, just stared out at the horizon, the rhythmic crash of the waves filling the silence. His energy, usually so bright and kinetic, was subdued, almost somber. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy from exhaustion and chlorine. "What do you see in that thing?" he asked, nodding at my camera. I was so surprised he was talking to me that I fumbled for an answer. "I don't know," I mumbled. "I guess. I'm trying to hold on to this. The color. The feeling. It's gone so fast." He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I felt the weight of his focus like a physical touch. His eyes, the color of warm whiskey, were searching, curious. "You think a lot, don't you, Lane 4?" he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "It's Julian," I corrected him quietly. "Julian," he repeated, tasting the name. "Okay, Julian. So, you're trying to stop time?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of understanding, a simple, profound acknowledgement that saw past my quiet exterior to the core of who I was. And in that moment, something shifted. The orbits realigned. He wasn't just the sun anymore. He was a person, sitting next to me on a cooling beach, watching the world fade to gray. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. Swimming, school, our hometowns, the weird feeling of being an adult who wasn't really an adult yet. I learned that his boisterous confidence was a carefully constructed shield for a deep-seated fear of failure, a pressure to live up to the expectations of a family of high achievers. He learned that my quietness wasn't aloofness, but a preference for listening, for absorbing the world before trying to make my mark on it. That conversation was the cornerstone. We returned from that trip not as teammates, but as friends. Inseparable friends. The kind of friendship that movies are made about, the kind that makes other people slightly envious. We became an institution. Leo and Julian. Julian and Leo. We moved into an off-campus apartment our sophomore year, a shabby two-bedroom with mismatched furniture and a perpetually sticky kitchen floor. It was our sanctuary. We navigated the rest of college together, a two-man team. I was the one who made sure he ate something other than takeout during finals week. He was the one who dragged me to parties when I threatened to become a complete hermit. I edited his painfully earnest essays on economic theory. He helped me build darkroom equipment in our spare bathroom, patiently holding things in place while I cursed at shoddy instructions. He was the steady, predictable beat of my life, the constant rhythm beneath the noise. And somewhere along the way, without my permission, the simple, clean lines of friendship began to blur. I can't pinpoint the exact moment. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was more like the slow, imperceptible turning of a season. Maybe it was the winter he got a bad case of the flu, and I spent a week bringing him soup and checking his fever, the feeling of his forehead, hot and damp beneath my palm, sending a jolt through me that had nothing to do with concern. Or maybe it was the time I saw him across the quad, laughing with a group of friends, the sun catching in his hair, and my chest seized with an emotion so fierce and possessive it scared me. It was a low, constant ache, a background hum of longing that I learned to live with, to manage, to meticulously conceal. Loving Leo was like living with a secret garden in the center of my chest. I tended to it in private, but the door was always locked. Because Leo, for all his emotional intelligence, operated within a very specific, heteronormative framework. He dated girls, a string of them, all bright and beautiful and, to my biased eye, fundamentally wrong for him. I played my part. I was the supportive friend, the good-natured third wheel. I listened to his relationship woes, offered advice I didn't entirely mean, and smiled through gritted teeth at the women who would curl up next to him on our couch, in the space I felt was mine. Each one was a fresh pain, a new reminder of the unbridgeable gulf between us. But none of them lasted. There was always something missing, some essential connection he was searching for that he never seemed to find. After each breakup, he would retreat back to me, to the safety of our apartment, to the easy, uncomplicated comfort of our friendship. "You're my constant, Jules," he'd say, slinging an arm around my shoulders. "The one thing that's always solid." And I would just nod, my heart a tangle of gratitude and despair. Solid, safe, platonic. I was the harbor, not the ocean he wanted to explore. I accepted my role because the alternative, risking the friendship for a love that was likely unrequited, was unthinkable. Losing him entirely would be a kind of death. So I stayed quiet, and I waited, without even knowing what I was waiting for. The shift, when it came, was not born of romance, but of stress. After graduation, we both stayed in the city. I started a small freelance photography business, scraping by on weddings and corporate headshots, while Leo was immediately snapped up by a fast-growing tech startup. He was brilliant, a natural coder with an intuitive grasp of complex systems. He thrived on the pressure, the long hours, the feeling of being part of something new and disruptive. For the first couple of years, his life was a steep, upward trajectory of success. He was promoted twice, given his own team, and put in charge of the company's flagship project, a revolutionary new data management platform. It was his baby, the thing that was going to make his career. And then, about a year before the wedding, it all started to go wrong. It began with small bugs, then larger system failures. Deadlines were missed. The client grew anxious, then hostile. The pressure on Leo became immense, a crushing, relentless weight. He started working later and later, his nights bleeding into mornings. The vibrant, easygoing man I knew began to fray at the edges. He lost weight. Dark circles bloomed beneath his eyes like bruises. His laughter, once a constant presence in our apartment, became a rarity. He was a ghost haunting the edges of our shared life, fueled by caffeine and anxiety. It was during this time that he started dating Amelia. They had met through a mutual friend, and she was, on the surface, perfect for him. She was an event planner, organized and ambitious and beautiful. She was a calm, stable port in the storm of his professional life. Or so it seemed. But the storm was too powerful. His work crisis was a black hole, pulling all light and energy into it. He would come home from the office, sometimes well after midnight, looking like a soldier returning from a battle he was losing. His eyes were hollow, his movements heavy with exhaustion. He'd drop his keys on the counter with a clatter that sounded like a surrender, and just stand there in the quiet of the apartment, as if the effort of taking another step was too much to bear. Amelia, for all her good intentions, didn't know how to reach him in that state. She would try to talk to him about her day, about wedding plans, about things that belonged to a normal, functioning world. But Leo had left that world. He was adrift in a sea of code and deadlines and the terrifying possibility of failure. He couldn't connect. Their conversations became strained, their dinners punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences while he stared at his phone, his mind a million miles away. And so he turned to me, not with words, but with a kind of gravitational pull. He started seeking out my presence, my silence. He would find me in my studio, where I'd be editing photos late into the night, and he would just sink into the worn armchair in the corner, not speaking, just being. He'd watch the images flicker across my screen, The only sound the quiet click of my mouse and the hum of the computer. There was an unspoken understanding in those moments. I didn't ask him how work was. I didn't offer solutions or platitudes. I just let him be, offering him the quiet anchor of my presence. I made him tea. I'd leave a plate of food for him, knowing he'd forgotten to eat. These were small, simple acts, the familiar currency of our long friendship. But something was different now. There was a desperation in his need for this quiet space, a raw vulnerability I had never seen in him before. He was shedding his armor, piece by piece, in the safety of our home, and I was the only one there to witness it. The lines of our friendship, so carefully drawn for so many years, were beginning to dissolve under the acid of his stress. He was lonely, truly and profoundly lonely, even in a relationship, even on the brink of marriage. And his loneliness began to call out to mine. The ritual began subtly, almost by accident. One night, he came home so late and so utterly depleted that he didn't even make it to his own bedroom. I found him the next morning asleep on the living room couch, still in his work clothes, his laptop open on the floor beside him. He looked younger in sleep, the lines of stress smoothed from his face, but also incredibly fragile. I covered him with a blanket and went about my morning quietly, the sight of him stirring a painful tenderness in my chest. A few nights later, it happened again. Then again. The couch became his default sleeping place. It was a silent agreement. I wouldn't comment, and he wouldn't have to explain the chasm that was opening up between him and Amelia, the fact that he couldn't bear the thought of climbing into bed next to her and pretending everything was fine. Then, one night, the geography of our apartment shifted. I was already in bed, reading, when I heard him come in. The familiar sound of his keys, the heavy sigh. I heard his footsteps pause outside my bedroom door, which I always left slightly ajar. I expected him to continue on to the couch, but he didn't. The door creaked open. He stood there for a moment, a silhouette in the dim light from the hallway. I held my breath, my heart starting a frantic, uneven rhythm. He didn't speak. He just walked over to my bed, pulled back the covers on the empty side, and slid in, fully clothed. He turned his back to me, curling into a tight ball, and within minutes, the tension seemed to drain out of him, replaced by the slow, deep breathing of sleep. I, on the other hand, did not sleep. I lay there, rigid, my body thrumming with a mixture of terror and elation. He was here. He was in my bed. The solid warmth of his back was just inches from my chest. I could smell the faint scent of his cologne, mingled with the stale, metallic smell of his office and the clean scent of his shampoo. It was an intoxicating, overwhelming combination. I stayed awake for hours, listening to him breathe, every nerve ending in my body screamingly aware of his proximity. This was a new territory, a dangerous and uncharted land. The pretext was exhaustion. The plausible deniability was ironclad. He was just too tired to make it to his own room. Or the couch. It was a story we could both tell ourselves. But we both knew, in the silent, charged space of that bedroom, that it was something more. That night established the new normal. It became our unspoken routine. 4 or 5 nights a week, he would come home, bypass his own room, bypass the couch, and slip into my bed. He never said a word about it, never acknowledged it in the morning light. In the daytime, we were just roommates, best friends. He would talk about Amelia, about the wedding plans, about the latest crisis at work, and I would listen, playing my part. But at night, the masks came off. In the dark, he was just Leo, and I was just Julian, and the space between us was filled with a silent, desperate need. His need for comfort, for a place to finally, truly rest. And my need for him, a need so vast and deep it felt like it could swallow me whole. Sometimes he would sleep with his back to me, a warm, solid wall of denial. But as the weeks went on, he grew bolder. He would turn in his sleep, his arms slung over my waist, his face buried in the crook of my neck. His leg would tangle with mine. These were the movements of sleep, unconscious and innocent, and yet they felt like confessions. I became an expert in the cartography of his sleeping form, the subtle shifts and pressures that spoke a language more honest than any words he would ever say. I learned the exact weight of his head on my shoulder, the rhythm of his heartbeat against my back. I lived for those nights, for the stolen intimacy of the darkness. It was a beautiful, exquisite torture. I was his sanctuary, his human tranquilizer, his safe harbor. But the peace he found in my arms was my torment. Because with every touch, every shared breath, the hope I had tried so hard to bury began to grow, wild and untamable, a vine creeping through the ruins of my self-control. I was drowning in proximity, starving for a sign that this meant to him even a fraction of what it meant to me. This clandestine ritual, this shared space of silent intimacy, became the central pillar of my existence. It was a fragile architecture built on a foundation of unspoken rules and plausible deniability. During the day, we orbited each other in the familiar patterns of our friendship. He would rush out in the morning with a quick, "See you later, Jules," often before I was even fully awake, leaving behind only the faint indentation of his body on the mattress and the lingering scent of his presence in my room. He would be at work, wrestling with code and calming anxious clients. He would be with Amelia, tasting wedding cakes, visiting venues, performing the role of the devoted fiancé. And I would be in my world of light and shadow, trying to capture the emotions of strangers on film while my own were a chaotic, uncontainable storm inside me. The days were a masterclass in compartmentalization. I would edit photos of smiling, happy couples, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I would have coffee with friends and talk about my work, my life, carefully omitting the most significant part of it, that every night, I became a human anchor for the man I loved. The nights were a different universe entirely. They had their own physics, their own language. The sound of his key in the lock was the starting pistol. My entire body would tense, listening to his movements. The sigh as he dropped his bag, the soft tread of his footsteps down the hall, the pause outside my door. It was a breath held in the lungs of the entire apartment. Then, the gentle creak of the door, the whisper of his clothes as he undressed in the dark. He'd started shedding his work clothes for a t-shirt and shorts, another small erosion of the initial pretense, and then the dip of the mattress as he settled in beside me. For the first few moments, there was always a palpable tension, an awareness of the line we were crossing. He would lie on his side, facing away, and I would lie on mine, a sliver of cold air between us. It was a silent, mutual acknowledgement of the strangeness of it all. But sleep, or the pretense of it, was a powerful solvent. Inevitably, the gravitational pull would win. He would shift, rolling toward me, and the first point of contact, a knee brushing mine, a hand settling on the mattress near my hip, would send a shockwave through me. I became a connoisseur of his exhaustion. I could tell by the set of his shoulders how bad the day had been. I could read the level of his anxiety in the tightness of his jaw, even in the dark. On the worst nights, he would be restless, his limbs twitching with residual stress. On those nights, my role shifted from passive harbor to active comfort. I would, with infinite care, reach out and place a hand on his back, rubbing slow, steady circles between his shoulder blades. The first time I did it, he flinched, a sharp intake of breath, and I immediately started to pull away, my heart hammering with the fear that I had overstepped. But then he relaxed, a long, shuddering sigh escaping him, and he leaned into my touch, a silent surrender. After that, it became part of the ritual. My hand on his back, a steady, grounding presence in the turbulent sea of his thoughts. He never spoke of it, but the way his body would soften under my touch was its own kind of thank you. This nocturnal world was my secret kingdom, and also my prison. I was closer to him than anyone else on earth, privy to a vulnerability he showed no one, not even his future wife. And yet, I was utterly alone in it. There was no one I could tell. How could I explain it? My best friend, who is engaged to be married, sleeps with me every night. Not like that. It's just sleeping. He needs it. And I let him. It sounded pathetic. It sounded like I was a willing participant in my own heartbreak. And maybe I was. But the thought of denying him this comfort, of closing my door and sending him back to the couch, or worse, to a lonely bed in his own room, felt like a cruelty I was incapable of. It felt like abandoning him when he needed me most. So I endured the paradox. I cherished the weight of his arm over my chest, while simultaneously being crushed by it. I breathed in the scent of his hair on my pillow and tasted the bitterness of a love that could only exist in the dark, under the guise of something else. I was a photograph, slowly developing in a darkroom, the image of my own despair becoming clearer and more defined with each passing night. The crossing happened on a Tuesday in late April. It had been a particularly brutal day for him. The project's launch date had been pushed back again, and the company's investors were getting nervous. He came home smelling of stale coffee and defeat. He didn't even go through the pretense of starting on the couch. He came straight to my room, his movements heavy and slow. When he got into bed, he didn't turn his back to me. He lay facing me, the space between us charged with a new, unfamiliar energy. The dim light from the street lamp outside my window cast his face in soft grays, illuminating the exhaustion etched around his eyes. We lay like that for a long time, just looking at each other in the near darkness. The silence wasn't the usual, comfortable quiet of our ritual. It was taut, stretched thin, humming with everything we had never said. "Jules," he finally whispered, his voice a rough, broken thing. It was the first time he had ever spoken to me in this bed, in this space. The sound of my name in the darkness was both a shock and an inevitability. "Yeah," I managed, my own voice barely audible. My heart felt like it was trying to climb out of my throat. He swallowed, his gaze unwavering. "I'm so tired," he said, and it was a confession that went far beyond physical exhaustion. It was a soul-deep weariness. "I'm tired of fighting this." I didn't know what this was. The project? The wedding? Us? I didn't dare ask. I just watched him, my entire being focused on his face, on the subtle twitch of a muscle in his jaw, the faint tremor in his lower lip. He lifted a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment in the air between us before he slowly, tentatively, reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my forehead. His touch was feather-light, but it burned a trail across my skin. My breath caught in my chest. This was it. The ground was crumbling beneath me. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice cracking on the last word. The question hung in the air, unfinished but perfectly understood. It was a question of immense weight, asking for permission to shatter everything, to cross a line we had both so carefully pretended wasn't there. It was a plea for me to make the decision, to absolve him of the responsibility. And in that moment, all my years of self-preservation, of carefully guarded feelings, evaporated. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of my love for him. I didn't trust my voice, so I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, closing the small distance between us with an agonizing slowness. It wasn't a rush of passion. It was a slow, deliberate surrender. His lips met mine, and they were soft, hesitant, questioning. The kiss was gentle, almost chaste, but it was laden with the weight of 1,000 unspoken nights, of 1,000,000 unasked questions. It tasted of coffee and desperation and a sorrow so profound it made my chest ache. I kissed him back, pouring all the years of my silent love, my patient waiting, my quiet anguish into that one, simple act. It was a confirmation, a confession, a catastrophe. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against mine, and I felt a single, hot tear fall from his eye onto my cheek. He didn't say another word. He just curled into me, his face buried in my neck, and for the first time, I wrapped my arms around him completely, holding him close, as if I could protect him from the world, from himself, from what he had just done. And in the ruins of our simple friendship, amidst the wreckage of his carefully planned life, he finally fell asleep. The aftermath was a brutal, deafening silence. I woke the next morning to an empty bed. The space beside me was cold, the sheets rumpled. There was no note, no text, no sign that the cataclysmic event of the previous night had ever occurred, save for the phantom feeling of his lips on mine and the lingering scent of him on my pillow. He was gone. He had fled the scene of the crime, leaving me alone with the evidence. The day passed in a surreal, anxious haze. I checked my phone 100 times, my stomach twisting into a tighter knot with each passing hour of silence. He didn't come home that night, or the next. My calls went to voicemail. My texts, simple, non-confrontational messages asking if he was okay, were met with a stark, blue-ticked void. It was a new kind of torture, one far worse than the bittersweet agony of our nightly ritual. Before, there was ambiguity, a space where I could plant the seeds of hope. Now, there was only the stark, ugly clarity of his regret. He had panicked. He had crossed a line and was now frantically trying to erase it, to pretend he had never even seen it. By avoiding me, he was avoiding the truth. And in his absence, the apartment felt cavernous and hostile. Every corner held a memory of him, his laughter, his presence. My own bed, once a sanctuary of stolen intimacy, was now a crime scene. I couldn't sleep in it. I spent 2 nights on the couch, the very place this whole slow-motion disaster had begun, wrapped in a blanket, feeling foolish and used, and utterly, devastatingly heartbroken. Had it meant nothing to him? Was I just a pressure valve, a convenient, warm body to absorb his stress and confusion? The thought was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting blade in my gut. On the 3rd day, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was eating me alive. I knew I had to find him, to force the confrontation he was so desperate to avoid. I had a pretty good idea of where he would be. There was a small, 24-hour diner halfway between our apartment and his office, a place we used to go to for late-night study sessions in college. It was his thinking spot. I found him there, huddled in a booth in the back corner, staring into a mug of black coffee. He looked terrible, worse than he had at the peak of his work crisis. He was unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked up as I slid into the booth opposite him, and for a moment, I saw a flash of raw panic in his eyes, the look of a cornered animal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have the energy for anger. All I had was a deep, weary ache. "Leo," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You can't just disappear. You can't do what you did, and then just vanish." He flinched at my words, staring down at his coffee cup as if it held the answers to the universe. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick. "Jules, I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" I pressed, needing to hear him say it. "For kissing me? Or for running away?" He looked up then, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Both," he whispered. "All of it. I don't know what I'm doing. My life it's a mess. I'm a mess." And then it all came pouring out of him, a torrent of confession and confusion. He talked about the wedding, about how the closer it got, the more it felt like a cage descending around him. He talked about Amelia, about how he loved her, he really did, but it was a comfortable, logical love, not the all-consuming, terrifying thing he felt when he was with me. He admitted that our nightly ritual had become the only real thing in his life, the only time he could shut off the noise in his head and just be. The kiss, he said, wasn't a mistake. It was an inevitability, the logical conclusion of months of leaning on me, of finding his home in my presence. But it was also a betrayal of everything he was supposed to be, of the life he had built. He was getting married in 6 weeks. He was supposed to be in love with his fiancée. He wasn't supposed to be in love with his male best friend. He didn't even say the word love. He couldn't. The closest he came was, "What I have with you, Jules." It scares the hell out of me, because it feels more real than anything else. I listened, my own pain momentarily eclipsed by his. He was trapped, caught between the life he was supposed to want and the feelings he couldn't deny. He was terrified of blowing everything up, of hurting Amelia, of disappointing his family, of facing the truth about himself. His panic, his flight, it wasn't a rejection of me. It was a rejection of the chaos I represented. It was a desperate attempt to cling to the safety of the life he had so carefully constructed. "So what now?" I asked when he finally fell silent, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "What do we do, Leo?" He shook his head, looking utterly lost. "I have to marry her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have to. It's too late. Everything is set. I can't destroy her like that." And hearing those words, hearing him choose the lie, choose the performance, was like feeling the last bit of hope drain out of me. He was going to walk away from whatever this was between us, and he was asking me to stand beside him at the altar and watch him do it. The 6 weeks leading up to the wedding were the longest of my life. A tense, unspoken truce settled between us. He moved back into his room, the door firmly shut at night. Our apartment, once a shared sanctuary, became a demilitarized zone, partitioned by silence and regret. We spoke only when necessary, about logistics for the wedding, about superficial, safe topics. The easy intimacy we had shared for years was gone, replaced by a painful, awkward formality. I was fulfilling my duties as best man, a role that now felt like a cruel joke. I helped him pick out tuxedos, organized a bachelor party that felt more like a wake, and listened to him practice his vows, his voice hollow and rehearsed. Each task was another twist of the knife. I was helping him build the altar upon which he was going to sacrifice his own happiness, and mine along with it. I saw the toll it was taking on him. He was a ghost, going through the motions with a detached, automated precision. He smiled when he was supposed to smile, laughed when he was supposed to laugh, but his eyes were empty. Amelia seemed to notice his distance, but attributed it to pre-wedding jitters, to the ongoing stress at his job. She would try to pull him close, to reassure him, and I would watch him stiffen, enduring her touch rather than welcoming it. He was living a lie, and the effort was draining the life out of him. And I was his co-conspirator, the silent keeper of the truth that was destroying him. I considered backing out, telling him I couldn't do it, couldn't stand there and be a party to this monumental act of self-deception. But I couldn't abandon him. As much as he was hurting me, he was in his own private hell, and a part of me, the part that had loved him for a decade, still felt the primal urge to protect him, even if it meant my own destruction. So I stayed. I put on the suit. I held the rings. And I walked into that church, prepared to witness the end of everything. And so I stood there, at the altar, watching Amelia walk toward him, a vision of everything he was supposed to want. The ceremony unfolded like a slow-motion dream. The minister's voice droned on about love and commitment, the words echoing hollowly in the vaulted space. I watched Leo's profile, the rigid set of his jaw, the way he swallowed repeatedly. He was holding himself together by a thread. When it was time for the vows, he turned to face Amelia, taking her hands in his. He began to speak, reciting the words we had practiced, the promises of a future he didn't want. His voice was steady at first, but then it began to falter. He stumbled over a word, paused, and looked up, his eyes searching for mine over Amelia's shoulder. It was a desperate, drowning look. And in that moment, I broke our silent, painful truce. I gave him the slightest shake of my head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But he saw it. It was all the permission he needed. It was me, finally, telling him that it was okay to stop pretending. It was okay to choose the truth. He stopped speaking. A confused, anxious silence fell over the church. Amelia looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Leo," she whispered. He let go of her hands and took a step back, a shudder running through his entire body. "I can't," he said, his voice cracking, but it was loud enough for the front pews to hear. "Amelia, I am so sorry. But I can't do this." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Amelia stared at him, her face a mask of confusion, then dawning horror. He turned and looked at me, his face a wreck of anguish and relief. And then he did the only thing he could. He walked past me, down the side aisle, and out a heavy wooden door, leaving behind a church full of stunned guests, a heartbroken bride, and the shattered pieces of the life he was supposed to live. The silence he left in his wake was absolute. And then, chaos erupted. But I didn't stay to see it. I followed him, walking out of that church and into the terrifying, uncertain, but finally honest, future. I found him sitting on a low stone wall in the church's memorial garden, his head in his hands. The sounds from inside were a muffled roar, but out here, the air was still, scented with roses and cut grass. I sat down next to him, not touching him, just offering the quiet solidarity that had always been our language. He didn't look up for a long time. When he finally did, his face was pale, his eyes hollow with shock at what he had just done. "I just destroyed her," he whispered, his voice raw. "I'm a monster, no," I said, my voice quiet but firm. You would have been a monster if you had said, I do. You would have destroyed her slowly, over years, with a lie. This was honest. It was brutal, but it was honest. He looked at me, his gaze searching, desperate for absolution. What now? He asked, the same question he'd asked in the diner. But this time, the context was entirely different. Everything was broken. Everything was possible. The weeks that followed were a blur of fallout and quiet rebuilding. There were angry phone calls from Amelia's family, heartbroken conversations with his own disappointed parents, the logistical nightmare of canceling a life that had been meticulously planned. Leo weathered it all with a strange, somber calm. He was devastated by the pain he had caused, but underneath the guilt was a current of profound relief. The crushing weight of the lie had been lifted, and for the first time in over a year, he could breathe. He was fragile, and I became his caretaker. We existed in a bubble within our apartment. I made sure he ate. I listened when he needed to talk, sitting with him in silence when he didn't. We didn't talk about us. It wasn't the time. The wreckage of his old life was still too fresh, the wounds too raw. We were in a liminal space, a quiet purgatory between what was and what could be. The intimacy returned, but it was different now. It was chaste, comforting. He started sleeping in my bed again, but there was no tension, no unspoken question. It was simply about proximity, about not being alone in the dark while the ghosts of his decisions swirled around him. He would fall asleep with his head on my chest, and I would lie awake, stroking his hair, feeling not the torment of unrequited love, but the steady, quiet hum of a deeper connection, a bond being forged in the crucible of his crisis. We were healing, separately and together, in the silence. About 2 months after the non-wedding, things began to settle. The angry calls stopped. Life began to find a new, quieter rhythm. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I walked into the kitchen to find Leo standing at the counter, pouring 2 mugs. He was wearing an old t-shirt of mine and a pair of boxers, his hair a mess from sleep. He looked younger, more peaceful than I had seen him in years. He handed me a mug, his fingers brushing against mine. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, my heart giving a familiar, hopeful squeeze. We stood there for a moment, sipping our coffee in the sun-drenched kitchen, the silence comfortable, easy. It felt like coming home after a long, arduous journey. He finally broke the silence, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from his mug. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he began, his voice hesitant. "About everything. About us." I held my breath, waiting. "For years," he continued, finally looking at me, his gaze clear and direct. "I thought of you as my anchor, the one solid thing in my life. I knew I needed you, but I never let myself ask why. I just took the comfort you gave me without ever really thinking about what it cost you. And I am so sorry for that, Jules. For my blindness. For my cowardice." He took a deep breath. "I was so scared of what it meant to need you in the way that I did. It didn't fit into the plan. It didn't fit into who I thought I was supposed to be. But the truth is, the plan was wrong. The person I was trying to be wasn't me." He set his mug down and took a step closer, his hands finding mine. His touch was warm, steady. "My life fell apart so that I could build a new one. An honest one. And I don't know what it looks like yet, but I know I want to build it with you. If you'll still have me." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring his face. All the years of silent waiting, of secret heartache, of patient love, culminated in this quiet, sunlit moment. All the complex, tangled emotions simplified into one, pure feeling, relief. "Leo," I whispered, my voice thick. "There's never been anyone else." A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a real smile, one that reached his whiskey-colored eyes. He leaned in and kissed me. It was nothing like the desperate, sorrowful kiss in the dark. This one was gentle, certain. It was a promise. It was a beginning. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no grand pronouncements, no dramatic swells of music. Real life is messier than that. There was still healing to be done, for him, for me, for the people we had hurt along the way. But as we stood there in our kitchen, in the quiet of a Saturday morning, it felt like peace. It felt like certainty. That night, for the first time, He walked into my room not out of exhaustion or desperation, but with clear, quiet intention. He opened the door, which I had started closing, and stood there, a soft smile on his face. He didn't have to ask if it was okay. I just pulled back the covers, and he slid in beside me. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, and this time, when I held him, there was no fear, no anxiety, no agonizing uncertainty. There was just the profound, peaceful feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. The door to my room, once a symbol of unspoken invitations and blurred lines, was now a threshold we had chosen to cross together, intentionally and honestly. The ritual, born of crisis and denial, was transformed into a new kind of sacrament, an affirmation of a love that had finally found its voice, not in grand declarations, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. We were just two people, in a quiet room, finally home.